Hello and welcome to our fourth episode of COVID and Coffee. Today we have with us my dear lifelong friend, Irena Jayne Banks, class of 92. I was just saying how Irena and I met each other when I was 7 and she was 9, even before I went to CSG.
Yeah, I remember that.
And Irena this will be her 19th year as a K through 8 teacher. She has recently moved from middle school into elementary school. And she has also been working diligently with her professional development team in her school system to be a educator, a diversity, equity, access, and inclusion educator amongst her peers. So today, and I could think of no other person who would be able to instruct us on implicit bias than Irena. So I am going to now take it over and send it over to you, Irena, and let's get started. Oh, and before that, I'm sorry, if you haven't muted yourselves, please mute yourselves. Thank you.
And I encourage everyone to please use the chat box as often as you so desire. Like, just as much as you want, you can message anything. That would be great, because that's going to be propelling our discussions.
Actually, yes, as Irena said, if you have questions as we go along, put them in the chat and I will be facilitating those questions and we'll get them out there. So thank you so much. Go ahead, Irena.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. This is quite a turnout, even more than I think I was expecting. And I hope people continue to join us and come in. We will be discussing implicit bias. There might be things that you already know, things that you might not realize. I want it to be a learning experience. I do have a couple exercises and ways for us to kind of break out. So I want you to please make sure that you have a piece of paper and a writing utensil before we get started. Because we will be doing an activity relatively early in this episode. So jumping right in, when we talk about implicit bias, let's first define it. Like, what is implicit bias? Because sometimes we hear terms and they just kind of come up, and then we start to get a little desensitized and we don't really understand. We just kind of hear it, but we don't necessarily understand what it means. And if you don't understand what it means, you certainly can't understand how it impacts your personal life or how it affects you in your interactions. So implicit bias is, first of all, it's something that happens at a very, 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 it exists at a very deep, deep, deep subconscious level. And that's very important because that's very different from explicit bias, which also exists. And implicit and explicit bias are not mutually exclusive. They absolutely kind of work hand in hand, but you do not have to have explicit bias to still possess implicit bias. And the thing about implicit bias is that everyone has them. Everyone, every human being has implicit bias. It's not a reflection necessarily of a poor upbringing, and I don't mean poor as in socioeconomic. I mean just like something where it was lacking maybe morally. You don't have to necessarily have been brought up by parents that were saying divisive things, or phobic conversations or racist comments. That's not necessarily indicative. You could have the absolutely best, most socially conscious and socially aware and culturally sensitive parents in the world, and you'd still have implicit bias. And we're going to talk about why that still exists, how it exists, and how it still gets into the subconscious. The thing about implicit bias that I think is also important for everyone to remember is that many times it contradicts how we see ourselves. It even contradicts our best intentions. It contradicts the things that we want to believe about ourselves, and even the efforts that we make in how we navigate this world to be decent human beings that are inclusive and socially conscious and, culturally proficient. Implicit biases many times they can contradict, many times they do contradict those things. And that's why it's important to discuss this and be aware of it. I also want to make sure that we know that implicit biases can be both negative and positive. So I don't want everybody to think, oh, implicit bias is a bad thing. It's something that I need to rectify because it's negative or because the biases are negative. It's something we need to rectify. It's certainly something that we need to be aware of, cognizant of, something that we really need to always kind of check into, self-assess, and just kind of always be cognizant and aware of them. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily negative, and that's why we need to be aware of them. So something else about implicit bias, many times our implicit biases will look at whatever group within which we identify favorably. That's it kind of inherently happens that whatever our personal group, whatever that is, however we identify, our biases will be favorably to ourselves and then tend to by default be less favorably to anything that is other or outside of our personal group. So that's important. However, even within the same group, you'll find that there can be negative, like there's subdivisions within even our own group. So like for an example, if I wanted to say like within the white community, you'll have, it's kind of inherent just based on the way society is set up and the way that in this United States, that's the dominant culture, that's kind of at the top that kind of dictates, it's the default. And that's what we see most of, and that tends to kind of set the standard. So within white culture, that tends to, white culture, and even outside of white culture, that tends to, the implicit biases that most people have regarding the white community and white culture are going to be seen more favorably. But within that, if you were to take it from incredibly affluent white individuals, and then how you subdivide that to middle class or very poor, and then when you start it based on what you see, what you attach or associate to poor white individuals, and the terminology and the stereotypes that come with that, versus whatever preconceived ideas or any kinds of perceptions or opinions that you might have when you look at very affluent, whether it's the top 1% or whether it's whatever. But as you can see, all of that still falls within just the white community. But again, there's these subdivisions where even within that group, you can still have positive and or negative biases within that. And that happens within any group. That's possible within any group. So the things that contribute to or create our implicit biases, and the reason, well, before I go there, like the way that so implicit biases are these opinions, these knee-jerk opinions and perceptions of people around us that are often based on or rooted in stereotypes or representation. It's not necessarily rooted in fact. Most of these are kind of perpetuated by stereotypes that have been created and are perpetuated in many different facets throughout society. So, for example, even before the example where I kind of broke down within the white community, within a group, the way those things break down, well, why does that happen? How does that happen? So the instant that you step into a room, or if you're sitting there and someone steps into the room, immediately, the first three things that are going to immediately catch your attention and start the brain processing on a very rapid level and even at a subconscious level, the first thing you're going to see is a person's race or color. whether you think you see color or not. You're going to see that. Next, you're going to see, and it's almost like in this order, you're going to see the person's biological sex. You're going to see whether they're male or female. And after that, you're going to start assessing status, meaning you're going to determine whether that person looks wealthy, whether that person looks poor, whether that person looks, unkempt, what have you. And then all of the things that are associated, whatever implicit biases that you have pertaining to that combination of three factors, it's there. And then it's going to directly impact your interaction with that individual. If you have any interaction with that individual, those are the three things that are going to immediately shape the way that interaction plays out. And so the things that create that, and the reason why that is, the reason why those three things and the implicit biases happen so fast is, and these are what creates them and also some of the barriers to them. So it's an issue of representation or lack thereof. So again, going back to the dominant culture and that being the default. So by virtue of that, the majority of images that we see are going to be representative of white America. And when I say that, I mean, if you think about billboards, if you think about the images even on our currency, if you look at commercials, advertisements, when you look in entertainment by way of film, the majority of our protagonists tend to be white people, and they tend to tell white stories. When you look at even within education in our history books and much of our, not even history, most of our textbooks are going to still primarily feature white individuals, even subtly where it might be, it could just be the names, even if they don't necessarily have visuals. If it's a math book and it's like, Sarah has, 6 apples and gives 5 apples to Becky. Inherently, and also because of implicit bias, mentally we kind of associate names like Sarah and Becky to white individuals. And we tend to associate names like Pedro, Diego, Alfonso. We're going to look at that and immediately be, oh, that's probably a Hispanic person. Even though anybody can be named Sarah or Lauren or what have you, but inherently that's what we associate to those names. So it doesn't even have to be images where you have to see a white individual versus a Hispanic individual versus a Black individual versus an Asian individual for there still to be that kind of reinforcement of white as the norm. And so in our educational system, that's kind of the default. When you look at the news and how it's how people of color are represented and covered versus white individuals, those things feed into implicit bias. A representation, for example, I said, like, when my daughter was very young, she's 21 now, but when my daughter was very young, and like most children and most parents of children, you show them or they let them see Disney films, just basic, seemingly harmless. But you have to think about what's being reinforced there. When you look at Disney princesses and everything that it means to be a princess and the flowy dress and the flowy hair and the romantic story, putting aside the patriarchal, misogynistic, sexist, whatever, just focusing on race, that's primarily white representation. Now, what does that do then for the white child? It reinforces these positive images and it allows them to see themselves in those princesses and all of those positive messages. And let's not get confused. Yes, I know there was Mulan and Pocahontas, and we finally got to Tiana, but none of those were really princesses in any capacity. They might put them up there with the Disney princesses. The closest thing that we had was Princess Jasmine, and even that was, again, steeped in stereotype, perpetuating bias regarding Middle Eastern. We don't even really know Agrabah. We don't even know exactly what that was supposed to be representing. Therefore, it further perpetuates that it was stereotypical. But when you look at Mulan, she's not a princess. So you finally get one Asian female lead, positive message, but it doesn't, it's still, you're not a princess. When you get to Pocahontas, oh yay, Native American representation, even if it's historically false and it's sensationalized from fact. She's the daughter of the chief, which princess, but she's not called Princess Pocahontas. So that perpetuates and continues to reinforce that message that white children can look and see themselves in. By default, the child of color only sees that association with white individuals. And what does that then say about who they are and how they can then also be a princess and whatever we associate to that? So when my daughter was very young, she just loved Cinderella, Cinderella, Cinderella. And when we would go to the Disney store, you know, the only thing that you could find were long, silky blonde wigs. And, you know, children are imaginative and they want to pretend. But as a parent, it was heartbreaking because I wanted her to have something that allowed her to still be herself and see herself, even in her imaginative play. And there was nothing there for her. So that's the kind of nuanced subtlety of those biases, because we're being fed these images no matter how our parents are bringing us up, but these things are being reinforced even in seemingly harmless things as parents trying to, you know, just raise their children. We're sending these messages to our children. These messages are being sent to our children, and it would require a very proactive effort to, every time you see, you know, Disney princesses, to be like, now, not all princesses are come this way, and blah, blah, blah. And most parents don't think to do that because we kind of see it as relatively harmless because it's Disney. But even in cartoons, even if it wasn't Disney, cartoons, most of the protagonists are white. Advertising. And here's also the interesting thing about that when I talk about advertising or when I talk about film. In the instance, and it's more rare when it's non-Black people of color, because we had Joy Luck Club and then we had Crazy Rich Asians. And that was a big deal because 25 years apart, those were the only two films in the United States that featured, you know, an entirely East Asian cast, produced and written by an East Asian, you know, producer and screenplay writer, et cetera, et cetera. But most people kind of dismiss if it's a Black film which features a predominantly Black cast, aside from Black Panther, and that's because it was Marvel Comics or whatever. Don't get mad at me, DC, Marvel, whichever one it was. I think Marvel. But aside from that, if there's a film that features a predominantly Black cast, then most people feel like that's for Black people, and you'll find that non-Black people rarely think that that's a film that they would have interest in seeing. Again, why is that? Because it's not normalized. We don't have Black Americans, Asian Americans. The fact that they're even hyphenated is already a problem in and of itself, but we don't see that as comprehensive so that white America would be just as intrigued and just as interested in those films that don't feature white protagonists as they would in the majority of films that do feature predominantly white cast with very peripheral characters of color. And then again, when you see those characters of color in those films, it's often perpetuating the stereotype. So you'll see Asians as, you know, technicians, scientists, you know, they're the tech person that they go to, whether they're Southeast Asian or East Asian, they're the ones that we turn to, you know, for code cracking and IT work. And, you know, if you have that kind of token Black character, it's still very peripheral. They're rarely seen as romantic leads or romantic interests. There's very little storyline that incorporates it in a cohesive way that normalizes everybody the way that we'd like to believe we have in this kumbaya post-racial America, but it's still not happening. And we're not getting anything that is reinforcing what we would like to believe. as such, that's going into the subconscious and continuing to sustain these implicit biases that we all possess. And it works both ways. Now, it's not a negative stereotype to say that Asians are good in math and science. That's not negative. I mean, it's good to be good in math or science or any subject matter for that matter. It's great. It's great to be proficient. The issue is, what then does that say to the Asian individual that is not proficient in math or science? Or do we even think that that exists? Does that even cross our minds that that might actually exist? It's not a negative stereotype to say that Black people naturally have rhythm and can dance. That's not negative. Or that they're naturally, athletically superior. That's not necessarily negative. But again, what does it then say? And where does it create division? Or what problems surface when you find that Black individual that doesn't have rhythm and cannot dance and absolutely sucks at sports, like has absolutely no ability when it comes to the court or the field, the turf, the diamond, whatever. So that's kind of the nature of those things. And what we need to understand is that because of this representation and lack thereof, and the way that the media perpetuates these things, that feeds into systemic racism. And with systemic racism as it is, that becomes a huge barrier to dismantling or addressing or kind of checking these implicit biases, because now you've got this system in place that is designed to keep things in certain places and is going to continue to perpetuate the things that we then see in the media, entertainment, and the representation or lack thereof. So it's all very interconnected, and this also feeds into or leads to microaggressions when we have these interactions with others. Many times microaggressions will kind of spew from the mouth, which don't necessarily, again, have to be negative, but it still feeds into these interactions. So what I want to do, and I promised myself I wasn't going to prattle on and talk a whole lot because I really, really don't want to do that. I'm going to, I would like for you to get your paper and your writing utensil. And I'm going to share with you an activity that I want to share first before we go into these other things. And I just want you to answer and be as honest as possible. I don't want you to think about what you think is a right or wrong answer. It's not a quiz. It's not something that, it's not anything to pat yourself on the back or feel bad about. It's just kind of, again, taking inventory. And they had a few of these that were like, some were geared towards children, some were geared towards, different ages of children, whether it was adolescent, high school, or whether it was younger children. And then they had this one for work settings, which I just think kind of encompasses adulthood. But I want you to notice, and if you want to mark it on your paper, that 1 is very comfortable and 5 is very uncomfortable. 3 is neutral, and then you've got comfortable, uncomfortable. And you're going to see there's going to be several sections, maybe like 5 or 6 sections that have some statements, and you're just going to number 1 through 5 as to your level of comfort in these social situations. Again, there are no right or wrong answers. Just be honest with yourself. Don't overthink the situations. And it's going to be interesting to see, because it's going to break these things down into our comfort level, which feeds into our implicit biases regarding race and ethnicity, gender, age, weight, or ableism, whether how we feel about someone that may have different or less physical abilities than we do regarding, whatever assistance they may need in mobility. So let's first look at section A. Everyone see my screen? Eris, are we good? Can you see this?
We're good. Would you do me a favor? Hit that F12 for me to see if we can.
Is that good?
That's what I like. Thank you very much. Kindly.
Okay, so these are sections A and B. Sorry about that. Thank you. Eris, pop in anytime. Like, please interrupt me and make sure that I'm not just
Oh no, you're doing
running my mouth.
We're gonna circle back to the chat because we
Microaggressions.
we'll get there. We'll get there at the end.
Okay. All right. So I want you to look at sections A and B, and again, and these are, you're not numbering them 1 to 5, like which one you're more, for each one, give it a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 with your level of comfort. And Eris, if you can just let me know whether or not you think it's time to move on. I want to give everybody sufficient time. I want to give them at least a minute.
Sure. Okay.
Good?
I think let's go ahead and move on.
Okay, so let's go to section C and D. And I'll set the timer for 1 minute.
Thank you kindly.
We have another 30 seconds.
Irena, I can't see section.
I'm sorry, you said, wait a minute, hush. You said you can't see section what?
E.
We're not there yet. I'm going down right now.
Okay,
We're going
thank
to
you.
see section. There you got it. Here's section. I'm doing like 2 sections at a time, but the way this page is divided. So go ahead and do section E, and then I'll scroll down so that you can better see section F.
I really appreciate section E.
Yeah, I did too, and I knew you would appreciate it. I was like, oh, this is so in sync with the whole adipositivity movement. So
Indeed.
you ready for me to scroll down to see section F a little better? There's section F. I don't want you to see the results yet. We're going to look at those later. Eris, you think everyone's good?
Everyone good? I think so. I think there should be. I think we should be okay. Does anybody? If
Okay.
anybody, let me know now.
If anybody needs more time, just holler, please.
Yeah.
Or let me know if you're good.
Could you scroll back up to B really quickly?
B,
Yes.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Does anyone else need any other sections revisited or more time to finish?
Can I see F again, please?
You certainly may.
Thank you.
Oops. Uh-huh. And also make sure that you tally up your total, but don't worry about what that means yet.
I kind of need to see B again.
I'm sorry, say which one you need again?
B, just because she probably had some done already, so, but I missed the whole section.
What, B as in boy?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you good with F? The person that asked for F?
Yes, ma'am, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Here's back to me.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure.
All right.
Everybody good? All right, let me come out of this full screen.
F11.
Oh, I hit F12, sorry. Ha, 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 ha. Let me stop share for a moment. So are we, oh, let me get my video back up. It automatically, for some reason, by default, shuts off my camera. Are we good? Everybody can see me and hear me? Perfect. So we're gonna come back, we're gonna circle back to those totals. But I didn't want to, put a whole bunch of information out there and then everybody be like, I didn't want it to manipulate your answers. I wanted you to be honest and I didn't want you to be trying to think ahead. Because again, it's not right or wrong. It's about awareness, being cognizant, and just kind of figuring out where we may need to do a little work. So why? Why do we need to be aware? Why do we need to confront them? And how do these things affect us in our everyday interactions, besides just interacting with strangers? Let's talk about why this can be why it is so pervasive and why it can be very dangerous, dare I say. I'll say it can be very dangerous. So in our everyday interactions, think about the line of work that we have. Our implicit biases as educators, it's going to play into how we perceive our students and how we thereby treat them. So these are things that I believe kind of lead into our expectations, academic and behavioral, of our students. I think these are things that also contribute directly to the achievement gap, which is nationwide. This isn't in one particular school district. Nationwide, you have this consistent achievement gap when it comes to Black and brown males, primarily, in education that are disproportionately suspended and expelled from school, and the academic performance as a result is significantly lower. And there's a huge gap between what we see in our academic performance of our white and Asian students. As a physician, these implicit biases are going to absolutely play into how we perceive and further treat our patients. Studies have proven that there are, on fewer instances, the offering of pain medication to patients of color than when we look at our white patients. Implicit bias, whether or not we think that people of color have a higher threshold of pain, whether we think that whatever it may be, that plays into that. If you're a physician, if you are in the medical field, that can be very detrimental that's going to affect someone's health. Judges, even when we try so hard, we want to be fair and impartial, but in our judicial system, these implicit biases are going to play into our perceptions of the attorneys that are presenting their cases before us. It's going to play into how we perceive our litigants and the actual people on trial when it comes to our verdicts. Implicit biases are going to play into that. When it comes to administration or leadership, if you are in a management position, the way that you perceive and subsequently treat your employees is going to be linked to your implicit biases. How we work with colleagues, even, a bilateral move, like right next to each other, we're in the same place and we're just co-workers, but these implicit biases are going to absolutely play into our interactions there. I would go to say so much even in the spiritual leaders of whatever the faith, but if you have a diverse group of congregants or parishioners, I would say that, and I think it does. I'll tell you an example of where I see spiritual leadership and the way implicit bias kind of plays in. Many times you kind of see these missionaries and these, these altruistic spiritual leaders trying to spread the gospel and bring that information. And it's almost always kind of pumped up that they go to these inner city areas, these low income areas. They travel the world to these very rural, third world countries. And somehow or another, it perpetuates that white savior. But if you believe that the world needs God, wouldn't the white community need God just as much as these other underserved communities? But many times that's not what's advertised. They don't go into the suburbs and feel like they need to spread the gospel. They don't go to Europe and let's spread the gospel to, the Spaniards and, the Portuguese, but almost always you're going to see these missionary groups that are going into West Africa, that are going into India, that are going, into these very, almost always communities of color, and usually at a lower socioeconomic place. I think that's because of implicit bias. It kind of it implies that people of European descent already have what they need to be in connection with God and don't need any intervention or don't need any assistance or don't need any missionary work to bring them closer to God. And again, that plays into the whole, Europeanized images of God and biblical figures, whether it's in the Torah or the Quran, or, the images that have been perpetuated, or that most of those individuals are white. As a matter of fact, if you were to do a Google search and just type in the word God, you're going to be inundated with images of white. And what that does and why that's pervasive is that it then starts to equate whiteness as closer to godliness. And that, it's a snowball effect. It just continues to add to those things that get deep, deep, deep down inside of us. Store clerks, we see that all the time, whether or not they feel that they need to follow particular customers based on what they see. And again, that always comes immediately. Race, physical sex, status. Do they look like they should even be in there shopping? The assumption that they're there to steal? All of those things. So these are many, many facets of necessary interactions for a quality of life, for basic health care, for justice, for fairness in the legal system, for a quality education, just for a non-hostile work environment. All of the implicit biases absolutely play into every single facet of just everyday trying to make a living, trying to survive life. So I'm going to now go back to the results, which some of them are kind of self-explanatory as to what they're in reference to. And then we can probably share afterwards these discussion questions if we don't have sufficient time, Eris. But either way, I'm going to give you some resources because there is hope. And the hope is in the fact that our brains are malleable and they can always be reconditioned. And there are several de-biasing techniques and ways that we can absolutely address these things and fix them. Again, we're battling against systemic racism, so it's going to take a lot of work, and it'll get better, I think, when we start to dismantle that systemic racism, which is a huge hurdle. But on a personal level, we can absolutely be doing the work. However, you cannot change what you don't know exists. You cannot change what you don't acknowledge exists. And you cannot change something that you don't see needs to be changed or that you don't have the desire to change. So I can give you this information and you can be like, oh, this can change, but can't change if you don't see it, if you don't acknowledge it, and then if you don't have a desire to do something about it. So let's go back to that assessment. Let me share my screen. I'll F12 it for you, Eris, before you, before it makes you happy. Okay. Did I do it?
Try
Did I get it right? Try again. Is it not full screen?
F11 maybe?
Okay, let me try F11. Ah, there it is. Hey, Eris. Last time it was F12. This time it's F11. So here you want to compute your total for each section by adding up the numbers from your responses. If you marked an item non-applicable, just score it as a 3 for neutrality. But the higher numbers indicate greater discomfort with social situations, which is kind of common sense because the 5 was very uncomfortable and 1 was very comfortable. So section A, if it wasn't already kind of obvious, is your comfort level regarding race. And the more uncomfortable you are, well, it really doesn't matter. I would think that I don't want to say the more uncomfortable you are, the more implicit bias you have. What I will say is the more uncomfortable you are, the more negative implicit bias you likely have. And the more, was that uncomfortable? The more comfortable you are, I would say that you have probably more positive implicit bias, maybe. That's me kind of guessing. But of course, our level of comfort it's absolutely hand in hand with whatever implicit biases that we have. If you have these negative implicit biases, you're more uncomfortable, then you're going to have more knee-jerk reactions in your interactions with others that are going to reflect that. B has to do with gender, C has to do with sexuality, D has to do with disability, E has to do with weight and size acceptance, and then F is about age, and that would play into ageism. Is everybody good? Let me know if you need more time, please. Are we good? Eris?
I'm okay on this end.
Okay. If anybody needs more time, just holler and let me know, please. So I'm going to stop sharing. Well, I'll share again in a moment. Let me put my video back on. I want to tell you another way. So this is us self-monitoring or kind of self-assessing our implicit bias. There's another way to get a little bit more revelatory information about our implicit bias. You may or may not have heard that Harvard has a Project Implicit. Harvard University has Project Implicit, and they have these assessments that you can take that operate on a very kind of liquid, lightning fast pace, where you don't really get to manipulate what you think, and it kind of reveals things that will probably surprise you. And sometimes it's a pleasant surprise, and sometimes it's like, ew, I didn't realize it was that bad. So I'm going to share my screen one more time so that I can show you this website from Harvard. It's Project Implicit. You can do a Google search and just do the IAT. That's what it's called, the Implicit Association Test. Harvard, what have you. When you scroll down, this is the opening page when you click to take a test. At the bottom, you want to wish to proceed. It says, I am aware of the possibility of encountering interpretations of my IAT performance with which I may not agree. Knowing this, I still wish to proceed. When you click, you will see that there is gender, specifically Asian versus European American, size acceptance when it comes to fat versus thin, disability, Native American to white American. That's a very interesting one. We have things on transgender, Arab Muslims, skin tone. This plays into colorism. Colorism is the belief that lighter skin complexions are more positive and favorable and are often treated better than those with darker skin complexions. Many times, colorism is perpetuated within the same race. So when you come to dark-skinned Black people versus fairer-skinned Black people, this also is something that you see a great deal in the Latinx community. You also see it in Southeast Asian communities, where it's a big deal to not be to not have darker skin complexion, even though some of the darkest human beings on planet Earth are found in India. So, however, representation in film, when you see Bollywood films, they're almost always going to feature fair complexions. Information regarding presidents, weapons, sexuality, age, race, specifically Black and white, religion, gender, and career. So you can select on any number of these and take the implicit, what was it, the implicit awareness or something, I don't remember right now, but it's regarding your implicit bias. And so I would highly, highly recommend when you have for time to just absolutely check that out, because these are other ways that you can assess your possible bias and where they may be. Even if you disagree, it's still something that you can look at and certainly reflect on. Now I'm going to show you some follow-up questions. And we can probably just send this afterwards, okay. Because we have about 6. Well, we started a little behind schedule, but I don't know if we're still going to stop exactly at 2. You'll do what?
I said I would be happy to reclaim those 6 minutes.
Okay, well, either way, these are some discussion questions. It really, either way, however you want to do it, I'll take it full screen so that Eris doesn't get nervous. But these are some discussion follow-up questions regarding your results. And these are things for reflection. If you want to take a picture of this screen, or we can also send the link to this to you. But if you want to, just so that you have these things to reflect upon regarding your results.
Yes, what I will do is, Irena, if you'll send those to me, what we'll do is we'll send out everything, all of the, what you've shared today will come in a follow-up email so that everybody has those at their fingertips.
Perfect.
I want to know, I think that because of our, as we are coming to a close, Irena, if you're okay with it, I'd like to open it up to the floor if anybody has any questions.
Please. And there is a 5th question, just in case you want to read it, but there's 5 questions for follow-up. So we'll be sending this to you for you to do. And absolutely, I would love to, anybody that has questions or comments or reflections or anything, I don't want to restrict anyone to just asking questions. I would like for people, as you realize things, if you want to be like, oh, I saw this thing and it helped me or what have you, just kind of go jump in and do whatever it is that you feel you'd like to do. Oh, my video, I know. Sorry.
So I have a question.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi. I'm probably a little older than many of you, and my parents were from different ethnic cultures that created an incredible schism within me, because we would go to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we would stay with the Italian family, and all we would hear are the bad things about the Germans. And then we'd drive to the other side of the city to visit the German family, and we'd only hear bad things about the Italians. There was no legitimate racial discussion. It was only ethnicity, but none of this addresses that.
Right.
There is not an acknowledgement that what is white culture? White culture isn't even white culture because there are so many different buckets of white culture.
Well, if I could tap in, there is white culture, and people do discuss this. And so again, when we earlier in the session,
I understand that in the general normal population that this is, and I appreciate it and I buy into it. What I've never resolved though is that we need to have, within me, I need to have a discussion of like, what's the big deal if you're like Italian or German? I understand.
right. No. I do want to address that because it is a big deal, because it that wasn't instantaneous. You keep in mind when the Germans immigrated here, when Italians immigrated to the United States, when the Irish, when they first got here, you'd see the same kinds of signs and discrimination as you did during the civil rights, where they had segregated bathrooms and they didn't allow Italians to be served there. That's where those kind of smaller enclaves, that's why those kind of sub communities existed. Over time, then that started to fall under this umbrella of whiteness. So what you're addressing is absolutely relevant. It absolutely exists. But what I want to stress is that the way that it existed before, where there was a distinct, that was also with Jewish people. Jews were seen as a separate group, and that wasn't because of their faith. That was absolutely because of their ethnicity. And that's the distinction between race and ethnicity. But those things still exist, and there was absolute division. It wasn't until much later on where Italians, Germans, Irish, Scottish, any of these other European cultures were embraced into the fold of white. And keeping in mind, present day, if you see or meet a German immigrant or an Italian immigrant, someone that, is there, you're going to start seeing those same kind of ethnic differences. They're not going to even necessarily be seen as white, because when we talk about white, that's more of a social construct that we kind of equate to what it means to be American. So unless there's a distinct cultural tie to Italian culture, i.e. language, food, cultural practices, faith, unless you have that, if you are just of Italian heritage, but in all other intents and purposes, you operate under the American culture, then it kind of, it does fall under that umbrella and does get generalized. But your point is absolutely valid. I think that when you start talking about the distinction between race and ethnicity, that's where that plays in. But what you're saying is valid. It's just it doesn't manifest to the same degree as it used to. I don't think that now if someone meets a person, and they have that instantaneous, they're not going to have the same knee-jerk reaction unless, again, if there's an accent or a presentation that is distinctly Italian. But if they're just perceived as white, then the implicit bias that is associated with whiteness is going to be more. I wouldn't look at you and then start talking about your German versus your Italian heritage, because that's not what instinctively is presented physically to me. And you were only exposed to that when you went to the different sides of your families. You see? I don't know that anybody else, aside from someone that has the schism that you described, would necessarily have that same experience. That was something because of your specific makeup, but you absolutely had things that fed into that implicit bias because of your upbringing and your blended heritage. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's good to recognize that ethnicity does factor in a lot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's everywhere. I mean, a lot of times kind of think about if you paint the entire Black community as the same and then you don't factor in actual West African immigrants or East African immigrants, that's distinctly different. And I remember having a conversation with someone, and I was dating a guy from Ghana years ago, and she said something about, Black men, something, not offensive, just kind of general. And I was like, but an African man is not a Black man, like Black American culturally. And she was like, what's the difference? It didn't even register. And it wasn't offensive. It was just genuine ignorance, just not recognizing that, yeah, that makes a difference. Ethnicity and culture absolutely play beyond, appearance and skin color. I appreciate that.
I'd just like to pipe in and say, just from the point of when the Irish, Jews, German, Italians became white was actually in the 1950s.
There you go.
That's when the shift was.
Yeah, and that's good. I mean, that's important to know because until that shift, you absolutely did see the very same kinds of discrimination as we talk about now when we talk about more significantly, visibly different physical features.
Anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask in our last few moments?
Can I make a comment?
Please do, Marty Simmons.
So on that note, what she was just talking about. So
Sure.
my husband's family always told him they were German. And then his brother took an Ancestry.com test, and it turns out they're entirely Irish. So for some odd reason, his grandparents thought, or great-grandparents thought it would be better for them to be German than it would be for them to be Irish.
Irish, absolutely.
I always think that's funny. Also, I'm here I'm here because of you, but I'm here because I learned about implicit bias in social psychology, but I needed kind of a refresher course because of my husband, because he, I always tell him, no, you're doing this thing, it's called implicit bias. He's like, oh yeah, well explain it to me, and I'm like, oh my god, dude, I don't have time to Google all that just to remind myself. So it's kind of a refresher. But then some of those questions were really funny to me, because the one where it's your coworker is married to a Mexican. I'm like, I work in the restaurant industry. I don't know any coworker that isn't married to a Mexican. But then there are subtle differences. They could be Guatemalan. They could be from Honduras. So I make a point of asking people de donde eres, and then they tell me. But then, wait a minute. Wait. Oh, and then just if I'm in a Japanese restaurant, there's only Japanese people. Then I'm like, damn, they must have good food,
That's right. That's right.
But then, being in a city where I'm the only white person, or being in a situation, I went to the Bronx with this guy that I met, and I was literally the only white chick there. And I was like, this is cool, I guess I want to point out that my kind of mantra when this is happening is, or when I'm approaching this society, is I always try to say, not necessarily. That's my big thing. And I always say that, when my husband says something like, oh, well, you know how they are, I'm like, not necessarily.
Necessarily,
and
right,
I think
right.
That if that's my biggest way of breaking down those specifics of what I think, because I know they're not true. So it's something that I learned to do just by saying not necessarily.
Yeah.
And
I think you know, Marty, I think part of the reason why you're able to even make that shift is because of your exposure to differences. You got to keep in mind that in most parts of, because of redlining and the way that society has been set up, and even just the demographics in certain states, there are places in this world where you don't have to have any interaction at all that you don't want to have. I think a lot of times, for the dominant culture, you have to choose to step into those areas where you'll be the only or one of very few white individuals in that space. Whereas most people of color are often one of few in a space of white. So it does require an effort on your part, or just a matter of circumstances that allowed you to even see something for yourself differently than what was just being fed to you, for you to be not necessarily. And if that wasn't necessarily the experience of your husband, that would make sense for him to be like, well, you know how they are, because he hasn't had that not necessarily experience that shows otherwise. And so that's awesome. That is one of the ways to kind of de-bias the mind. You have to kind of get into those spaces and learn for yourself, see for yourself that those differences do exist, and there are plenty of things that defy the stereotypes that have been fed to us.
Right. Well, I mean, I want to point out also there's the mere exposure effect, where the more times you're exposed to something, the more you like it, actually.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's
That's good stuff. No, I love that. Thank you so much. Eris, we're a little over time. 2 minutes.
Well, that's okay. You know, no, that's okay. We're actually right on time. In my mind, we're right on. And again, unless I will, you know, generally we run about 70 minutes.
I'm done. I've presented all that I needed to present. So
say we'll take one last question or comment. If anybody, and if not, anyone? See, this is why I said this. I'm like, I don't like this. Oh, Karen.
Oh, hi, Karen Jones.
Hi. Hi, I just popped my mic off to say love you and hi.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Yeah. We just need to stay aware. You know, it's not about judgment. It's just awareness, self-awareness, becoming more aware so that we can do the work on the inside, so that that's what we're able to then do outside. Got to start with us. That's wonderful. My pleasure, my pleasure. Anything else, Eris, K. Rosh, Manhattan?
Jenny, did you have something to add?
No, I was just going to say thank you. I had to pop in and out quite a bit for work stuff, but I was trying to be present.
That's all right. Well, she's going to post it on YouTube. You can go back and
Good.
look at it.
So good. All right. Well, then I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us today. I am so thrilled, as I said from at the first episode, that it's not just going to be one time thing. We're going to be continuing the conversations.
Excellent.
Irena, I know, you know, my policy is I will ask you once, and then all of my guests absolutely have an open door invitation to come back. You had mentioned microaggression. So I would like to say that if you're interested in coming,
I would love to come back and discuss microaggressions. That would be my absolute pleasure.
That would be fantastic. So then with that, I am happy to announce that we will be having 4 more new episodes coming up of Social Justice Now. Yes. So again, here's to the progress. Here's to the work. Irena, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And everyone who's joined us today, thank you. And until next.
Yay! All the best, everyone. Thank you.